Have you ever thought that our planet might actually run out of sand? No, seriously, just take a look at a desert map. Nature's generously covered almost every continent with vast, dry, sandy areas. Let's not even try to count how many tons of sand that is. Just look at the Sahara. It stretches across an incredible 3.5 million square miles, making up 8% of the Earth's land. You could talk about a shortage if the sand there was just a thin layer, but the dunes of the Sahara can reach a height of 590 feet. That's almost like stacking two 314-foot Big Bens on top of each other. In other words, just this one massive desert alone has enough sand to supply a whole bunch of countries, but according to scientists, there really is a sand shortage. While there's a sand shortage going on, African countries are digging it up like there's no tomorrow. They're going at it so hard that they might be setting themselves up for disaster. Let's figure out how we got to this point and what's in store for Africa if this keeps up. First of all, let's look at why, despite there being billions of tons of sand on our planet, scientists are still sounding the alarm, churning out tons of news with headlines like, "The world is running out of sand." All the deserts on our planet, from Africa's Sahara to China's Gobi, just don't cut it. Yep, not a single one of the existing deserts is a good fit for people. So if you've ever wondered why we haven't put all those piles of sand to good use yet, well, there's your answer. The grains of sand lying in the desert are smooth, tiny, and rounded, shaped that way by the wind constantly sweeping across those endless stretches. On top of that, deserts are stuffed to the brim with nothing but sand, which is often full of all kinds of stuff people have no use for, like mica minerals, organic bits, sulfides, chlorides, and so on. Why isn't this sand good enough? Because you can't make concrete out of it. That's the main thing people need sand for. Desert grains just don't have the right shape to stick together well enough to form a solid building material, and even if they did, they'd still need to be cleaned thoroughly, since impurities could give the concrete unwanted qualities. It's also worth mentioning that people need quartz sand, that's what glass is made from, and it's also used to produce silicon. Unfortunately, deserts aren't the best source for it either. You can find sand with human-friendly properties in riverbeds, floodplains, lakes, and along the seashore, and there's way less of it there than in the deserts. Despite this, around 53 billion tons of sand are extracted from these places every year. Just imagine, that's the equivalent of every person on the planet using 44 pounds of sand every single day. Some crazy numbers. Still, nobody's going to stop digging spots that have the sand we need. Humanity's developing. There's constant urbanization, meaning the growth and expansion of cities. New buildings are going up in huge numbers. Old ones are being expanded, and some are being renovated. For all of this, as you can imagine, concrete is needed. According to Coastal Care, it takes 200 tons of concrete to build a typical concrete house. But for the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, they used 121,254 tons of concrete. Yes, it's a unique building, but similar projects are becoming more common these days. Oh right, almost forgot. Besides concrete, there's a lot of glass in the buildings. For example, the Burj Khalifa needed 18 million square feet of it. As you can imagine, glass isn't just used in that Dubai landmark. A concrete box with no windows is interesting, of course, but that's pretty rare. So you'll find glass in almost every modern building. You could say that sand is also an essential part of today's technological development, smartphones. After all, there's glass in them too. Cars also have glass. Along with that, silicon's made from quartz sand. And that's the chips inside phones and computers. Almost any modern tech has silicon in it. Do you see how much sand we need? Since the early 2000s, China alone has used more sand every 3 years than the USA did in the entire 20th century. Will China stop? Judging by the huge number of megaprojects that use millions of tons of concrete, it doesn't look like it. In 2022, Leiden University in the Netherlands conducted a study in which scientists concluded the following. In the next 4 decades, the demand for sand will increase by 45%. This means that humanity will need to extract more than 20 billion tons of sand than it does now. And that's what causes the deficit. Nature's already struggling to replenish the resource in all rivers and lakes, and it's hard to even imagine how much worse the situation will get in the future. Now let's move to Africa, a continent with many countries on it that isn't at all bothered by any current or future shortages. Because of this, they might push themselves to disaster. But let's go through everything step by step. This is Kenya. As of 2023, the population here was 55.34 million people, which is quite a lot. and requires a huge amount of sand for construction and other needs. However, demand is constantly growing along with the population, which is expected to double in the next 40 years. Kenya's Vision 2030 programs already in place aimed at raising the average standard of living and income. Of course, improving these indicators is impossible without building extensive infrastructure. So Kenyans have decided to complete the construction of 35 public buildings, 300 new government structures, create a high-speed bus transportation network, and much more. In the same 2023, Kenya introduced 7 green projects worth a total of $4.5 billion. In particular, thanks to such projects, Kenya's construction sector has been growing about 5% annually in recent years and will continue to grow further. What's required for all this? A huge amount of sand, as they need concrete, glass, and all that. Where do the Kenyans get this crucial resource from? From rivers flowing through the country, which leads to huge problems. For example, sand mining in the eastern Makueni County is causing local people to lose access to water. Drying rivers are the usual thing for this local geography. In spring and winter, they fill with water, which goes into the sand and is stored there until the dry season comes. At that point, nearly 1 million locals get water by digging wells in the riverbed sand. You realize what happens when there's less sand? The water just flows down through the rocky bottom and isn't stored for use during droughts. This cliff didn't exist just a couple of years ago. Then they started digging intensively to get resources for construction. Yes, the lack of water is what worries the Kenyans the most in this case, but there's also nature, which doesn't particularly like when the natural order is disturbed. So according to local studies, sand mining has led to the destruction of sandy ecosystems, has caused the loss of birds and animals that depend on water paths. Trees and vegetation are also suffering. They're withering, which over time leads to the ecological degradation of the land and its transformation into an area unsuitable for growing anything. This is considering that Kenya, in general, isn't known for having a lot of fertile land. You know what else is bad about sand mining in Kenya? The income of the population is very low, so everyone tries to make money by any means, even illegal ones. Criminal cartels are forming in the country, hiring regular people who are looking for a way to survive and then sending them to work in illegal sand mining. Should I even mention that this kind of sand extraction is bad? It's probably not even necessary to mention because such illegal activities lead to a lot of problems, including the death of people. A study covering 4 counties in Kenya revealed that from just 1 up to 500 overloaded 10-ton dump trucks carrying illegally mined resources leave during the day. And how many of them travel at night to avoid the watchful eyes of the authorities? Let's remember the Makueni County, where river sand was being dug up, which led to a serious decrease in water levels in the area. It stands out not only for its destroyed river, but also because it's the only province in all of Kenya with a structure to manage sand mining activities. There's even a whole central body for sand, regulating its collection and trade. This has led to cartels either disappearing completely or becoming much less common. It's a good trend, but it's just one single region. In all other areas, illegal mining thrives, continuing to destroy ecosystems. This beautiful place is located in West Africa, in the coastal country called Sierra Leone. The white, sandy beaches with large mangrove thickets and small rivers serve as breeding grounds for fish. However, right now, they're actively turning into a workplace. The eyes of sand diggers are fixed on the local sand. For example, in the village of John Obey, located near the capital city, Freetown, there are 500 sand miners living. A huge number of them literally owe their survival to the snow-white beaches. The price of a ton of sand in the country went up from $25 in 2012 to $200 in 2021. This was due to the booming construction sector in Sierra Leone and the increased demand for sand from the glass industry in neighboring Guinea. Yes, sand mining helps people escape poverty. Each miner can now make about 150 to 200 leones, or $5 to $10 a day. At the same time, sand mining brings a lot of problems to the country. Sand in coastal areas acts as a barrier against erosion and softens extreme weather conditions. When it disappears, coastal communities face greater risks from storms and floods, and the completely unregulated extraction of the resource only makes things worse. Some of the businesses and houses standing near the shore get some of the damage from the incoming water, which was once held back by the beach sand. Others are completely destroyed. For example, in 2022, a flood hit Burra, a fishing village in the southwest of Sierra Leone. As a result, an entire cemetery was washed away. Due to the constant retreat of the shore and flooding, the beach in Burra is a wreck. Logs, iron rods, and everything else that was once buildings, it's all scattered along the shore. Sand mining also leads to the destruction of dense mangrove forests. They were breeding grounds for fish, birds, and turtles. Specifically along the coast of Sierra Leone, the mangroves were so abundant that the animals thrived and became a source of income and food for practically all the local people. The extraction destroyed large areas of mangrove forests, leading to the death of organisms, disruption of food chains, and a decline in the condition of ecosystems. After large-scale sand extraction began, the shores of Sierra Leone lost mollusks, crabs, and other sea creatures. Needless to say, many people living nearby suffered losses because of this. Recently destroyed beaches were really beautiful spots and definitely attracted tourists from all over the world. Yes, sand mining has even hit Sierra Leone's tourism industry. For example, in 2019, international tourism brought the country $83 million. It might not sound like a huge amount, but it's important to note that Sierra Leone is not a developed country. The GDP is just over $7 billion, so even that amount from tourism is significant. Anyway, you get the point. Sand mining is destroying the main reason why foreigners come to the country, the beaches. Besides the fact that tourists have fewer places to relax, local people lose their jobs because of sand mining. And you know what that leads to? Unemployed people look for new sources of income and end up getting into sand mining, which destroys the beaches. In short, it's a vicious cycle that makes things worse in the country. Now let's head to Uganda, a lush country in the heart of Africa. When you look at it, it's hard to imagine sand. Green forests, fields, and an abundance of crops. If you take your mind off things, you might even forget it's Africa, which is most often associated with lots of sand due to the Sahara. However, as you've already figured out, desert sand isn't what people need. The country has tons of wetlands where there's a huge amount of sand suitable for various tasks. The excavators have particularly focused on the coast of one of the largest lakes on our planet, Lake Victoria. And to be more specific, the active mining takes place in a region called Luwera. Sand is obtained in many different ways here. It's dug up from quarries and river ecosystems and collected from swamps and wetlands, every day and in huge amounts. Meanwhile, in the region of extraction, rivers and other water sources merge and then flow into Lake Victoria. The wetlands of Luwera serve as breeding grounds for fish and a stopover for migratory birds. And of course, the constant digging is clearly not doing anything good for the local ecosystems. What about the locals? Of course, like always, they're against all of this. What really bothers them is that most of the workers here are legal. So according to the locals, the government, which should be protecting Uganda's gem, Lake Victoria, isn't doing that and is actually allowing it to be destroyed. Plus, some of the miners are Chinese companies, so the locals are also upset that the profits from destroying local ecosystems are going to another country altogether. The authorities allowed digging in the swamps near Victoria, but with a lot of restrictions. For example, companies are allowed to dig up to a depth of 13 feet. However, people say that the machines drive onto the site with approved equipment, then take it off and dig deeper to a depth of 39 feet. Such deep pits are really hard to fill, and if you leave them as they are, the depressions naturally fill up with water, which then spreads out, flooding the houses and gardens of the local people. What does the government say? If not this way, then we'll have to import, and that's something the country would probably rather avoid because, like their neighbors in Africa, they need a huge amount of concrete. Development, that's how it goes. Uganda's government spending on infrastructure increased by more than 120% between 2017 and 2020. During this period, the administration allocated $812 million, $1.3 billion, and $1.8 billion for construction and transport, respectively. Furthermore, at the beginning of the 2020s, the country announced it would invest in a new urbanization and housing program worth $5.3 billion. This calls for an enormous amount of sand. According to some reports, in 2019 and 2020, it could have reached 5.2 and 6.2 million tons, respectively. And they're trying to meet this need by, among other things, digging around Lake Victoria. It's also worth mentioning that sand for construction is mostly not taken anywhere and stays in the country, but there's also the sand dug near the main water reservoir of Uganda, which is then sent abroad. This sand is considered the highest quality. Its silicon content reaches 99.95%, which makes it perfect for glass production. These are teenagers from Uganda, and once again, they show that sand mining in African countries is not only an environmental problem, but also an opportunity for the local population. Yes, the country has free primary education, but at the same time, there's a very high level of poverty. And obviously, people just don't have the money for anything extra. Because of this, teenagers mine sand from the riverbeds to earn money for school books. In short, sand mining in any African country is a highly ambiguous thing. On one hand, jobs, materials for development, and on the other, the destruction of ecosystems, which, among other things, leads to a loss of money. It's complicated. At the same time, it can definitely be said that sand mining in Africa does nothing to help avoid the global shortage. That's why humanity is actively thinking about how to reduce its reliance on sand. Of course, the most important and effective way to get rid of this shortage is simply not to use sand and concrete. Instead, for example, you could use graphene. That's what they claim at Manchester University and Rice University. It was already used in concrete. Graphene made the building material stronger and more durable. However, there was still sand in it, and now there are attempts to completely replace it with graphene. In this case, graphene is produced by flash Joule heating. Sounds complicated. And in practice, it's complicated too. The carbon-rich base material is quickly overheated using an electric discharge, after which it turns into graphene flakes. The base material can be metallurgic coke, which is made from coal. Scientists claim that the sand replacement indeed worked. At the same time, the resulting concrete was 25% lighter than the traditional version and showed a 25% increase in strength. But there's one huge problem. No one's going to use graphene instead of sand because its production is much more expensive than just grabbing a shovel and digging up some sand from a beach or a river. They're also suggesting recycled glass to replace sand. It's a good option. It's hard to say how much glass waste is generated in our world, but there's definitely a lot of it. Yes, glass is a recyclable material, but often it just doesn't get recycled. So why not put glass to good use? Of course, there were tests. For instance, at Deakin University, they discovered that glass powder and polymer concrete, which is a concrete alternative where polymer resin replaces cement, is a perfectly effective solution. It also makes the concrete even stronger. And using crushed glass cuts the cost of concrete production. Sand needs to be mined, washed, and sorted. Glass doesn't. The truth is, there's not nearly as much glass waste as sand. So first it needs to be found, then delivered to production, which means more expenses and longer production times. In short, there are indeed alternatives. However, while they might still seem somewhat doable in developed countries, in Africa, it's a whole different story. Since there's often a shortage of various equipment there, for now, regular sand won't be replaced by anything. Maybe in the future, when, as is often the case with humans, deserts like the Sahara will be the last places in Africa with some sand left.